Welcome to the Election University podcast, a weekly show where we hear from industry experts who share tips and tricks for winning campaigns. Whether you're running for office now, thinking about it for the future, or just want to know more about campaigns and elections, Election University is for you. With Election University, click, learn, win. And now, your host, Jason Bennett.
Hey everyone, this is your host, Jason Bennett. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Election University podcast. You'll notice from the intro that I'm flying solo today. My co-pilot, my co-host, my Robin to my Batman. Wait, maybe I'm the Robin. She's way more experienced at this than I am, so I'm probably the Robin. Anyway, the co-host, Rainey Cohen, is on her honeymoon. She got married a few weeks ago, and now she's stumbling the streets of Portofino to hopefully having a very good time. So we'll have her in future episodes. But I'm really excited about today's episode because this is the part 2 of the cybersecurity series that we're doing. Last week's episode covered ways that you and your campaign can lock down very simple strategies that you can use to lock down your campaign to prevent hacking as best as we can. With some very simple tools and suggestions on how to increase your security from a level 2, which is a very low level of security, to an 8, which is a much better, higher level of security. And this week's episode, we're going to take a little bit of a left turn. We're still talking about cybersecurity and hacking and the things that can happen on campaigns, but we're talking about it more from a voter integrity standpoint. We want to make sure that our elections have the highest integrity, and this doesn't just mean presidential races. It goes all the way down to the lowest races. We just recently saw that in Virginia, the state house is tied. One of the election races there in District 94, I believe it is, the person was up, I think it was 10 votes, and then the opponent was up 1 vote, and then they're going through the recount, and they counted 1 more vote, and now it's essentially tied, which ends up being a coin toss. Well, people need to have trust and believe that the election integrity in the system is solid. So we're going to talk with an expert on this today. I'm going to be talking with Coll Steele, who was in the legal department for the Hillary Clinton for America campaign in 2016. She has extensive experience on this. And so we're going to talk to her a little bit about what she has seen in the 2016 election cycle, what concerns her, what recommendations she has, what things we should be looking for future elections. And she's going to talk a little bit about what happened on the campaign during the 2016 cycle from her perspective. So I'm very excited to talk with her today. Our guest, Allie, has extensive campaign experience. So not only was she on, one of the biggest races last year, but she also has worked both on the Hill, in the House and in the Senate, and has extensive experiences on campaigns. So she was press secretary for the U.S. Senate Budget Committee. She was field director for Tim Kaine for Virginia. She was a financial and political director for U.S. Senators Maria Cantwell and U.S. Senator Patty Murray. So she has a lot of campaign experience. So I'm really excited to talk to her today. We're going to get right into it. Allie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's get right into it. Allie, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in politics, how you got involved?
I went to college at Tulane in New Orleans, and Hurricane Katrina actually hit my junior year of college. And I'd grown up in the DC area and was always sort of interested in politics. But having that experience in the city I was living in made me motivated to try to figure out a way to get involved in the recovery effort in some way. And so I reached out to Senator Mary Landrieu's office, who was one of the 2 Louisiana senators at the time, and ended up interning for her both in her DC Hill office and then later, and when I went back to school, in her New Orleans regional office, and helped with FEMA claims and other casework that they needed. The office was just inundated with calls from constituents who needed help, and they needed all the help they could get. So I basically worked full time as an unpaid intern, which will be a familiar experience probably for many of your listeners out there who are looking to get a start in politics, for almost a year, and felt like the plus was a guaranteed job at the end of it if I wanted it, because I had spent so much time working unpaid as an intern for them. But I graduated right in the beginning of the 2008 presidential primary season in June 2007. And everybody told me, you got to go to Iowa. And I was a little skeptical. I thought I would probably move back to DC or New York, where all my friends were moving. But I ended up applying for a job on the Obama campaign on the primary as a field organizer and moved out to the middle of nowhere in Iowa, where I knew nobody, and worked out there for 6 months as an organizer. And as you know, met my now husband and a lot of other lifelong friends while I was there. And if there's a campaign that's going to get you hooked on a campaign life, it was probably that 6 months experience in Iowa for Obama, where we started and nobody knew who he was. And by the end, we had won the state. So that was kind of the beginning of my introduction to politics. And from there, I just jumped around from a lot of different races, worked in Washington State for 4 years for Senator Murray and for Senator Cantwell, and then in Virginia in 2012 on Senator Kane's race before going to law school in 2013.
So last year in 2016, you worked for Hillary for America, Secretary Clinton's campaign for President of the United States. How did you get connected with that campaign?
Yeah, so in 2012, when I worked for Senator Kane, I was his statewide field director, and I was also the field director for the Democratic Party of Virginia. And the Obama campaign was doing a lot of our voter protection work and doing a lot of the statewide get out the vote efforts. But we were worried that Senator Kane was going to have a recount in that race. And the polling toward the end looked very much like the Senate race was going to be closer than the presidential race. So we started to put a plan in place to be prepared for a recount if we needed one. And we're trying to identify somebody to lead up that effort. And I was sort of on the fence about whether or not I wanted to go to law school at that point. I had taken the LSAT and had applied to some schools. And so I thought that it might be interesting to take on that project and learn a little bit more about election law and about recounts. And so I organized that effort for Kane, and in that process met Mark Elias, who is the chair of the political law group at Perkins Coie and was the general counsel on the Clinton campaign this last cycle. And so when I went to law school in 2013, I was a little unsure whether I was leaving politics behind and didn't really want to be. And so I kind of had my eye on the campaign all through law school. And as the 2016 election heated up and I knew I was going to be graduating in May of 2016, I reached out to Mark and mentioned that I was interested in putting my law degree to use on the campaign. And so that's how I ended up getting connected with him. And I started, I think, 2 days after I turned in my last paper for law school and jumped right into it, which was a little intense, but it was the only thing I really wanted to be doing in May of 2016, for better or for worse. So
yeah. Sounds very intense. So you were the Deputy National Voter Protection Director for Hillary for America. For the folks out there, the listeners out there who might not necessarily know what a presidential organizational chart would look like, what is that? What are the responsibilities? What does that look like on a national campaign?
We ran a pretty robust voter protection program. I think every year, every presidential cycle, it gets a little bit more sophisticated and the programs grow out a little bit more. And we had voter protection directors in every battleground state and some additional states as well. And they had teams of anywhere between, I'd say, like 5 or 10 people staff-wise, and then an army of volunteers. And in the battleground states, their role was sort of twofold. One was to recruit volunteer lawyers to help serve as poll observers on election day and for early voting in states where voting happens before election day as well, and to help staff our voter assistance hotline, which people could call into and ask questions about how and where to vote. And the poll observers mostly are there to help triage problems at polling locations on election day. They also send information up to headquarters and to the states about how turnout is looking and anything else that we should be aware of. And then the other piece is, we brought a lot of litigation against states that were passing restrictive voting laws and challenged a bunch of those laws which were new and had not been in place in the 2012 cycle. So we worked a lot internally with other departments on the campaign to advise them about what was happening with those lawsuits, how a ruling might affect our plans for GOTV or for mail pieces or for paid calls or whatever it might be, and generally reviewed and advised kind of internally as in-house counsel to other departments about how voting rules work in different states and how to talk about how people can vote from state to state.
Which states were you working in specifically?
Let's see. In Ohio, they had just cut back early voting pretty significantly and eliminated a week that was called Golden Week, where people used to be able to register to vote and cast a ballot on the same day. So we were challenging the elimination of Golden Week there. In Virginia, they had just passed a new photo ID law that had just been put in place in 2012, same in Wisconsin, but they hadn't fully implemented the rules around it in both of those states. So we challenged the photo ID laws in those states. Oh, and of course, North Carolina was the fourth state where we were the most successful in striking down a really overall package of restrictions on voting, from photo ID to various cutbacks in early voting. And the legislature had done so with a pretty clear intent to discriminate on the basis of race. And so we were able to get that law pretty much in full overturned in the courts.
So these voter protection laws probably haven't been fully realized on a presidential campaign before. I'm assuming that the net result of the Republicans sweeping into office in 2010 during the Republican wave, and then again in 2014, really accelerated some of these voter suppression laws. Is that accurate? Tell us a little bit more about some of the influences and how this may have impacted a presidential race for the first time.
Yeah, it was sort of two factors coming together at once. One was as you mentioned, the election of Republican governors and Republicans to legislatures. And at the same time, in 2013, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelby County to strike down parts of the Voting Rights Act that had previously been in place that required states to pre-clear any changes to their voting laws with the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. And that created a system where there were experts on these voting rules who would review them before they could be enacted and stop them if they were discriminatory or otherwise failed to comply with the Voting Rights Act. And in Shelby County, which was in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down the pre-clearance process, which meant that states could now pass these laws and they would go into effect immediately. There was no requirement that the Department of Justice approve or review them. So between those two things coming together at the same time, it was an unprecedented flurry of states passing new voting laws that went into effect essentially immediately without any review that had been in place for really the last 50 years or so.
The theme of this podcast is keeping Russia out of your campaign, basically locking down your privacy and security on your campaign, no matter the size of the campaign, whether you're presidential or down ballot campaigns for city council. And most of our listeners have read the headlines between the Hillary for America campaign and the Russian hacks, the breaches at the DNC, John Podesta's emails, and the like. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about, when you came on to the campaign, your experience with any of the breaches that had happened and how it impacted your portfolio specifically. Yeah,
so I started in the general right around, the time right around May, June. So I had really just started when the first DNC WikiLeaks hack occurred right before the convention. And I think people are pretty familiar with that, but essentially emails from a handful of key staffers at the DNC were hacked over the course of seems to be about six weeks to eight weeks or so, and then disseminated in full online on WikiLeaks. And they were emails with donors, fundraising emails, just your typical day-to-day sausage making of campaigns that were then out there for the whole world to see. And that obviously created, some communications issues. It put people in a position where emails that we have all written that we did not want everybody in the world to see immediately became public. And it was just, some of it dealt with internal party division between the Sanders campaign and the Clinton campaign. Some of it dealt with just managing events and donors and all of that. But it all became public all at once. And so it was partly, for everyone on the campaign to understand what had been released out there, and then to respond to that at the same time that everybody was heading to Philadelphia for the convention. And then the second big WikiLeaks event occurred in October when John Podesta's personal Gmail had been hacked, and just a barrage of his personal emails, again, that probably did not expect the world to see, would be released in troves every day on WikiLeaks. And in addition to those two things, there were two things that happened that affected the voter protection side. One was there were, and this was picked up quite a bit in the news, there were attempted hacks on a number of states' voter registration systems. So the central databases that house all the voter rolls were being attacked, and some of them were successfully breached, and some of them seem to have maybe not been breached, but they were attempted. And there were also, unclear whether it was connected or not, but there were attacks on generally the DDoS. There was a DDoS attack in October that really affected almost every major website, not just political websites, but Twitter went down for a while. And it was just a sustained kind of cyber attack that was really global in nature. But one result was it took down our voter assistance hotline for the day. And we were in the middle of early voting in a couple of critical states. And it took down HillaryClinton.com for a number of hours. Again, other major websites were affected as well. But that was just another thing that we weren't anticipating that happened in October, kind of right as we were getting our systems up in place to help voters who were heading to the polls.
For our listeners out there who might not be familiar with what a DDoS attack is, it's a distributed denial of service, which is basically an attempt to bring down your website by creating an overwhelming target website with fake traffic, essentially. So, Ali, walk us through a little bit what it's like for the employees for Hillary for America. I mean, I'm assuming at this point you have probably about 300 employees working on Hillary for America, and then maybe another 3,000 to 4,000 in the various state parties and coordinated campaigns and local parties throughout the country. What are they dealing with? What's it like a day in the life of a staffer after something like this happens? Walk us through that a little bit.
I think one of the things that I love about campaigns, and that is a sign of a well-run campaign, is that people sort of have their head downs and their lanes and their jobs that they need to do every day. And I think one sign of a campaign that is doing the right things is when people don't get distracted by big public news events that don't really pertain to their day-to-day jobs. So I actually would say on most of this, the communications people were busy responding to reporter inquiries about the DNC leaks or about the Podesta email leaks. And our research team was going through to figure out, what new information might be out there that wasn't out there before and how to respond to it. For me, on the legal side and the voter protection side, we weren't really that affected by the WikiLeaks hacks. We were more affected by the news around the attempts on the voter registration systems and on the hotline. And, when you just find out in the middle of the day that your entire national voter assistance hotline has gone down, including the hotlines in various states, it's just a bit of a triage moment, but figuring out, why we think they went down, if there's another number we can publicize, how we can get voters information in the meantime that they need about voting. Those were all some of the steps that we started to put into place. And fortunately, we knew exactly which states were voting, and it wasn't election day. And so for the states that were voting, we were able to, they had a front desk line at their main office that people already knew about, and we were able to roll out some guidance to the states about how to make sure that people continue to get the information they needed about where and when and how to vote.
You've worked on so many campaigns, including, as you mentioned, Obama in 2008. What do you do differently now than what you did then in terms of your own personal security, whether either on a campaign or privately with your own personal communications? And was this even a concern in 2008 at this level or anywhere near this level back then?
Yeah, it's funny. I remember when I first started as a field organizer, and this may still be one of the do's and don'ts that, gets rolled out at that first training. But one of the main messages that was hammered home was, don't put anything in an email that you wouldn't want to see on the front page of the New York Times. And email was a relatively new phenomenon back then. People weren't really communicating in long emails the way that we've become accustomed to today, or even short, almost text message like exchanges. And I remember another analogy somebody made at a training was that email is like a postcard. You should just assume that anybody can read what you're writing on there and it's not a secure form of communication. Then I think between 2008 and 2016, we all, myself included, just became a lot more comfortable with email. We became a lot more comfortable with texting, and so much more of our work happens online that it became kind of unrealistic to avoid email for things that you wouldn't want the New York Times to see or to have the whole world know about. And so I think that what happened in 2016 for me personally definitely reminded me of the fact that, email is not always a secure form of communication, and finding a balance between having a productive, work day, especially when you're communicating with people who are in meetings a lot, very busy, traveling a lot. You can't always realistically have a face-to-face conversation or a phone conversation. So I've just become more cognizant about, maybe not putting things in email that aren't necessary to put in an email, but I don't hold back from doing my work, saying the things I need to say, conveying things to people that need to be conveyed, even if, I would prefer that the whole world not see those emails. I think it's a little bit unrealistic to operate in the way that we were, the guidance was in 2008. At the same time, I think it's probably caused everybody, and certainly has caused me, to be just more aware of what I communicate online.
Yeah, that was going to be my follow-up question, was basically, what you went through in 2016, what your team went through in 2016. Do you think that made you all more cyber aware or more cyber paranoid on that spectrum?
I would say a little bit of both, but probably more on the awareness side. I think there are very easy things that you can do that I was not doing, that a lot of other people, John Podesta included, were not doing, that can just increase your security a lot online. And putting two-factor authentication on anything and everything that you use that you don't want to be hacked was one piece of advice that they gave everybody on the campaign in light of all of the WikiLeaks hacks. And so I now have that on everything from my personal email to my Amazon account to my PayPal account, and just, in general, I think not just for work or campaigns or your communications, but also just for your finances. And I think it just made you more aware to exercise more caution and just be smarter about what you do online and how you do it. But, I think that there's so much. I was thinking about your question about, how it's changed from 2008, and on the positive side, so much, we can do so much more now with targeting, with analytics, with disseminating information to voters about how, where, and when to vote. That, the fact that those, that our hotline went down or our website went down, it was, it's a big dent in what you're doing that day or in your project, but we didn't even have those things going on in 2008. So to lose access to perhaps your voter lookup tool for a couple of hours, it's not ideal, and we would prefer not to, but we have so much more sophisticated and much easier ways for people to get information that they need about how and when to vote, that overall, I think it's still a net positive. And I think that it's good to be more cyber aware, but it's definitely not a reason to shy away from using technology in the ways that can be really helpful to campaigns.
I'm really glad that you mentioned two-factor authentication. For our listeners out there who might not know necessarily what two-factor authentication is, it's basically a second way to authenticate that you are the user that should be accessing this email, this website, this mobile device, app, what have you. The most common way to two-factor authenticate is by having a 4 or 6 digit number text or emailed to you that you would then enter into your email, website, mobile device, what have you. And then that second layer essentially proves that you're the person who should be accessing the site, or makes it much more difficult for someone who shouldn't be to access it. And Benjamin Caudill, who is our cybersecurity expert who is sharing this episode with you, states in his discussion that essentially if you apply two-factor authentication, you go from a level 2 of security, which is a low level of security, up to a 6 just by implementing two-factor authentication. So it makes it that much more difficult, threefold essentially, to access sensitive information. I'm also wondering, other than two-factor authentication, if there were other apps or methodologies that you employed to increase your security as a result of what happened on the campaign trail last year.
Yeah, I mean, I think that specific apps I'm not so sure about, but a couple of general best practices, both between the campaign and also now I work at a law firm where we store a lot of client confidential information all the time. So we're very sensitive about, protecting our clients' information. And, a couple other easy things to do that I think the Clinton campaign did, but not all campaigns I had been on in the past did, were, to have good policies that people sign as a part of their, employee agreement or volunteer agreement about auto forwarding email or taking documents or taking files, with you, either by sharing them with yourself on a drive or sending them to yourself by email or putting them on a thumb drive. Having a policy in place that is clear that that's not something that people are permitted to do without approval from whoever their supervisor is a good best practice, I think, to have. I, for a long time, automatically forwarded all of my campaign email to my personal Gmail account because it was just easier for me that way. And in the Gmail account for, I believe, for the Clinton campaign, that was disabled entirely. Like I couldn't even have done that if I wanted to. So I think just having a handle on, how your employees are keeping their email and their documents protected and having a policy in place that gives them some guidance on how to do that is a good idea. And then relatedly, having somebody on your team, an IT person, or even it could just be a Google contact if you're using Gmail, who has the ability to remotely remove somebody's access or wipe a device or wipe a drive is a good idea. Just if somebody loses a phone, if they don't have the right passwords, on their phone, that way they can report it and you can do something about it. You can say, okay, this phone is now lost. We're going to disable access to our Google Drive. Those are kind of, simple things that I don't think, campaigns I've always have thought through in the past. But it will help, it'll help you just keep a manage on what's out there and how things are getting disseminated and how to clean up if somebody loses a laptop or gets something stolen. And having, some practices in place about what you're going to do when that happens is a good idea.
We'll have a lot of these best practices and suggestions in our ebook too on how to lock down your campaign and keep Russia out of it, which will be available on the website and in our show notes. Ali, you've also done a lot of fundraising as well. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the security and some maybe best practices that you would recommend around keeping sensitive credit card information or donor detail information. I imagine that there's quite a bit of security and privacy trade-off that happens when you're handling people's finances on campaigns. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you'd recommend in that space. Yeah,
I mean, I think that that stuff is actually probably more similar to what I deal with now in law, which is that I, as a fundraiser, I feel like I was often carrying around a file folder full of people's credit card information that, you just have to be really careful not to leave it in an Uber and, to make sure that you shred it all once it's entered online. But I think that there are, at this point, the online websites that people use for donations are pretty sophisticated and hopefully, have in place as much as an online store like Amazon does or could in terms of protecting credit card information. So I definitely feel like over the time I was a fundraiser, I moved more toward directly entering things online and not using paper forms as much as possible, which is kind of a contradiction for this theme, which is that, online may not be that secure, but I think that limiting having stuff in two places just increases the risk that it might get lost or end up in the wrong hands. So if you do use paper forms, I just make sure you have a system for shredding them once you've put them online. But I try not to store that information on Word documents or Excel sheets or anything like that, and just go ahead and enter it directly into ActBlue or whatever site you're using, and then shred the paper or whatever document when you're done. One thing that happened in the DNC leak is that a lot of donors had emailed their social security numbers or their credit card information to fundraisers for events to process it. And when the fundraiser the staffers' emails were leaked, donors had their social security numbers and their addresses from event invites and their credit card information released. And so one other best practice that I learned from that experience would be that's the type of thing that's good to pick up the phone and just get the credit card information over the phone. Same with social security numbers or any other personal identifying information. And if you're having an event at somebody's home, like a donor who's particularly sensitive or worried about this, another thing that I had never done in the past that I think have seen more and more often is to not put the address on the invite, but say, address will be provided upon RSVP. Just some ways like that to make sure that your donor's information isn't unnecessarily out there.
That's really great advice. Switching gears a little bit, what do you think is the number one threat to voter integrity, and what can be done about it?
So I think that the number one threat to people's ability to exercise their right to vote are all things that don't seem like a threat, but because they are not perceived as such, they actually are the most detrimental to people's ability to vote. So, for example, anything that creates long lines at the polls, the more of a barrier there is to somebody who has to wait in line for half an hour, for an hour to 2 hours to vote, the less likely they are to end up casting that ballot. And this can happen from everything. It's mundane and it's boring and it doesn't seem very sexy, but it happens from things like closing a polling location in a neighborhood so that now everybody votes at the same school when they used to vote at two different schools. And that is happening more and more often, and it's happening increasingly in minority communities. And it is the type of decision that does not need to be made through legislation. It is the type of decision in some places that the county board of elections or even the precinct, polling location manager can work with local government to decide. I'm not sure, it'll vary state to state. Election law does in very detailed ways vary, but it can happen really under the radar, and it can happen without campaigns even really realizing it's going to happen. And that can create extremely long lines, which end up suppressing turnout pretty significantly. And the other thing is, electronic poll books that we're using more and more often are supposed to help speed up check-ins, and they could, but they are not functioning well in a lot of places right now. And especially if a location doesn't have very good Wi-Fi or internet or good support, if an electronic poll book goes down, that will create a massive backup because nobody can check to see if you're on the rolls. One thing we pushed a lot was having for every polling location to have a number of paper poll books as backups so that they could turn to those if that happens, but not all of them do. So those kinds of things are, and then just your typical voting machine breakdowns. If you have a polling location that's supposed to have 5 voting machines and 2 go down before lunch, that's going to create long lines and a longer and longer backup. So to me, those types of issues, replacing our voting machines with new equipment, they are extremely outdated and breaking down and will continue to do so over the next couple of years, to making sure that as we move to new technology like electronic poll books, we have backup systems in place if they malfunction, to keeping an eye on making sure we have enough polling locations and are opening new ones rather than closing them. I think those types of things probably will make the biggest difference in how many people show up to vote in a given election. And then I think there's a newer threat that I'm particularly concerned about, which is this language around voter integrity and voter security that, we've seen especially after the 2016 election, but really has been around for a long time, which is this notion that there's a lot of illegal voting and a lot of fraudulent voting, which the studies just don't bear out to be true. And that has been around for a long time. But the new element that's being added is because people are aware that there were attempted hacks on the voter registration systems. A lot of states and local government and even law enforcement are getting involved in making sure there is security around voter information and at polling locations, which has the right intent behind it, which is that we don't want people's information to get hacked and certainly don't want to have another deterrent for registering to vote, because we don't want people to not do so because they're worried about their information. But there's really no correlation between having good cybersecurity in your central voter reg database in the capital city of whatever state and having, for example, a police presence at the polls. And the former is, to me, a smart practice that will help protect people's information, while the latter is something that could really deter people from showing up to vote who might be worried about that they're going, especially people in minority communities and Latino communities, the fact that there's going to be a Homeland Security presence at the polls, which was one thing that was floated around the 2016 election, is pretty guaranteed to depress turnout among completely eligible voters who have every right to vote and are registered to vote and should be able to. So, that's, I think a newer threat that I have a concern about. And I think one concern there is that it is a bipartisan issue to make sure that our elections are secure. And I think people on both sides of the aisle have been very interested in digging into what happened this election and making sure that we protect ourselves from and our systems and our democratic institutions from interference in the future. But I also think that, there needs to be some awareness, especially in terms of how we talk to voters about it, to make sure people feel comfortable voting and understand that, there were attempted hacks on these systems. But as far as we're aware, there wasn't anything that, that people have now been harmed by as a result of those. And that these efforts are really to make sure that you can and should register to vote and you can and should go to the polls, and not to create any kind of nervousness among people that they're going to put themselves at some kind of risk of having their personal information hacked if they vote.
If you're a local county commissioner candidate or local city council candidate, and you're thinking about these questions and you're concerned about voter integrity and security, what questions should you be asking your county election officials, your Secretary of State, your auditors, whoever is managing this data? And should they care about it? What advice would you give those local candidates?
Yeah, I think that, understanding a bit more about who makes the decisions about county by county voting, whether that's how many polling locations are going to be open, what hours the polls are going to be open, whether they're going to be open, for example, with early voting. One thing we focused a lot on the campaign was, are they going to be open on Columbus Day? Are they going to be open on the weekends, which are oftentimes when people have time to go stand in line and vote? And some states open their polling locations on Saturday and Sunday, and some only have them open Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And the access is really different in those two scenarios. And so a lot of what we did was try to advocate for more hours, more locations, especially for early voting. In some states, the people who make those decisions are elected and they are partisan. In some states, it's an elected 3-person group, 2 of whom have to be from one party and 1 of whom has to be from another. In other states, those people are appointed by the governor or appointed by the Secretary of State or the legislature. So understanding the rules in your area and who controls those decisions, and then doing whatever you can to lobby for more access to voting, whether that's directly to the person who gets to make those decisions or by getting involved in those local campaigns. If there's somebody who is currently making those decisions and you don't agree with them, donating or volunteering for those campaigns if they're elected positions is also another way to help get involved.
If you could write any piece of legislation, what would it be? And what specific vulnerabilities would you like to address in that legislation to make sure that our voting system is more secure?
So I think it's a good question there, and my answer is related to both, which is, on this topic, there's lots of legislation I would love to pass if I became Queen of the United States. But I think that
we already have one. We already have one. I'm sorry.
I think on this issue, automatic voter registration is the number one thing that I think that we can and should be doing to increase access and participation. So it would be essentially when you turn 18, you go to the DMV, when you get your license, the same way we automatically make people eligible for certain government benefits upon turning 18, and you can apply. I think that we should just automatically be registering people who turn 18 and who don't have any disqualifying felony conviction or whatever the rules are in a given state. That shouldn't be an extra step that you have to fill out a form and send it in. I think that, automatic voter registration nationally would be a huge way to just take some of the burden off of people. And also, we have so many good systems in place at this point between the Postal Service and other government agencies where we're already cross-checking this data to say, okay, this person now seems to have moved out of Virginia and into Ohio. So Virginia is already canceling their voter registration because they see they've registered in a new state. So we're already doing those kinds of things to account for, overlap. And I think that automatic voter registration would actually help that process because it would just put everybody into the pool. At the same time, I don't think that it's going to be politically feasible to pass that legislation until people feel assured that our systems are secure. And that means our online government systems, and it means anywhere else that information might go. And so I think having a really thought through conversation about who gets access to that data, making sure it's not sold to private companies, making sure that, to the extent political campaigns get that information, that's secure, in the ways that we have been in the past through through VAN or through other databases where campaigns can get access to a lot of voter sensitive information. I think it is important that we take an overall holistic assessment of how that all works and how automatic voter registration would change any of those processes, and make sure that we have that all under control and feel positive about it before we would try to push anything like that forward.
Given all the experience that you have on campaigns and in politics, what advice would you give someone who might be interested in breaking into this business or possibly running for office someday?
I think two things. One is corny and one is practical. So my corny piece of advice I'll start with, which is really just to follow your own gut about what it is that you want to be doing at a particular moment in time. And I think for me, that was really hammered home this past year because I struggled a lot with the decision in law school, whether or not I wanted to try to work on the campaign after graduation. And a lot of my classmates were applying for judicial clerkships and other more traditional jobs that people come straight out of law school and do. But a lot of those have really strict restrictions, especially if you are working in the judiciary, about even speaking about politics. It's a whole different world in terms of how political you're allowed to be. And I really wavered about whether or not I wanted to try to do something more traditional or wanted to work on the campaign. But my gut always told me that if I sat out 2016 and the chance to elect the first female president, that I would regret that. And ultimately, I moved toward that direction. And as the election played out and as Trump became the nominee on the other side, I just felt more and more convinced that for me, that was where I needed to be and what I wanted to be doing. And that I think I would have been really unhappy if I were sitting at a law firm or, in a clerkship in that moment when I wanted nothing more than to just be involved in whatever way I could in this election. So I'm really glad that I, even though things didn't turn out the way I wanted them to, in a way that makes me even more glad that I did what it was that I wanted to do in that cycle. So I think having a plan, but also being willing to deviate from it when you just have a feeling that there's something you need to do or you want to do or you want to speak out about is really important. And then my practical piece of advice is, which I think anybody who's been in politics for more than 5 or 10 years will agree with, is, just to treat everybody you encounter like they are an important donor, a potential voter, a volunteer. I've seen a lot of candidates who, and this is mostly geared toward anybody who wants to run for office, but I've seen a lot of candidates in my day who have sort of two personalities: their internal, their personality to people who they think are not that important, and their personality to people who they think are important. And in politics, that is never black and white. The person who was your intern at one point will probably be your boss at some point later on down the line. And the person who comes into a phone bank for you for one shift might be a millionaire who could give, max out to your campaign. And you're never going to know those things right away about people, nor should they be how you're deciding whether to treat somebody in a particular way or not. But, regardless of your morals or the golden rule, the idea that it just as a practical standpoint, it's not wise to, treat people who you think aren't important in a different way, because at the end of the day, I think that always comes back around to bite you. So that's my practical advice, I think.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice. Not just practical, but also very, very useful. As you're building relationships in this business, I think it's critical that you assume that someday that person who may be the scheduler for a particular legislator might then be the legislator someday themselves. So it's always a good piece of advice to treat everyone thusly. Allie, thank you so much for taking the time out today. This was a great discussion, lots covered, very meaty discussion, and I know you're super busy, so I really appreciate you taking the time out to join us today and share a little bit of your experience in politics and give some real practical, great advice for folks.
Yeah, of course. Well, thanks for having me. It was fun.
Thanks. A big thank you to Coll Steele for joining us today, the Deputy National Voter Protection Director for Hillary for America during the 2016 presidential election cycle. Thank you for sharing a little bit of your experience of what you went through during that crazy 2016 cycle. And also thank you for sharing your expertise on the vulnerabilities and the areas of concern going into 2018 and 2020. Really appreciate you taking the time out. And also thank you to our listeners. We appreciate you tuning in for another episode. We'd love it if you went over to iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, however you're listening to us, and leave us some ratings or a review. We definitely take the feedback that you leave us, and we use it to try to improve our service to our listeners. So thank you for providing it. If you think that you have a topic that you want us to cover, or if you want to be a guest on the show or think you know someone that should be, send us an email, podcast@electionu.com. Next week, Rainey will be joining me, so I will not be floundering alone on my own. And until then, thanks for listening. We appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. This week's episode has ended, but the campaign fun doesn't have to. Head on over to www.electionu.com, where you can access all of the links mentioned in today's episode, as well as the show notes. There you can also sign up for regular announcements or register for our campaign school. It's your very own online personal trainer for winning campaigns. www.electionu.com. Click, learn, win.